September 20th, 1939. Warsaw under siege. The 15th day of their new calendar. Night. A cold, damp night, saturated with the smell of burning, dust, and something else. A sickly sweet odor that had already become the familiar stench of death. Inside a sturdy bear cage, in the very heart of the bomb-ravaged zoo, sat 3 people. Once they were the Kowalski family. Now they were simply 3 survivors, their names seemingly erased along with their home, now a pile of rubble. Jan, a former architect, a man whose calling was to build worlds of concrete and glass, now sat on the cold stone floor, his calloused hands wrapped around his knees. His eyes, accustomed to the precise lines of blueprints, were fixed on a small white ball of fur, trembling in the corner of their shelter. A rabbit. Pushek. The last fragment of the pre-war world belonging to his 6-year-old son, Adam. Jan's gaze was as heavy as a tombstone. There was no pity in it. There was no love. There was only the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon looking at a gangrenous limb. Nearby, covered by a ragged blanket, lay his wife, Elżbieta, and beside her, curled into a ball, Adam slept. The boy was smiling in his sleep. Perhaps he was dreaming of their sunlit home. Perhaps he saw Pushek twitching his nose as he nibbled on a carrot. Elżbieta was not asleep. She felt her husband's tension. It vibrated in the damp air of the cage like a taut string. She knew what he was thinking. For several days, the thought had lived between them, silent, ugly, and inevitable. Hunger. Not just hunger, but the kind that becomes a beast, gnawing at you from the inside, devouring your thoughts, your will, your very soul. They hadn't eaten anything substantial in 3 days. The water Jan painstakingly procured from the zoo's damaged drainage system was no longer enough. Their strength was failing them, especially Adam. He grew quieter each day. His laughter, which had once echoed even in this hell, had fallen silent. Slowly, trying not to make a sound, Jan reached for the sharpened piece of rebar lying beside him. His weapon, his tool, his curse. At that moment, the rabbit, sensing danger, scrambled to the farthest corner, its tiny heart hammering out a frantic rhythm that seemed audible even over the distant roar of artillery. Picture this scene. A civilized man, an architect, a father, locked in a cage like a primitive creature preparing to kill his child's only joy to prolong his suffering for one more day. How did they come to this? How did an elegant European capital turn into a primeval jungle, and a man into a beast hunting in a stone den? To understand how Jan Kowalski transformed from a creator into a hunter, how his family traded their cozy living room for the damp concrete of a bear cage, we must go back 20 days. Back to the last day of peace, when the Warsaw sky was still blue, not black with soot, and the only predator they feared was time, relentlessly bringing the summer to a close. August 31st, 1939. Warsaw was living its last day of peace, though it did not know it. The city breathed a calm that was nevertheless pierced by an almost intangible anxiety, like a low hum you feel more with your body than your ears. Newspaper headlines screamed about tensions at the border, about Germany's new demands, but people, weary of the endless political fever, tried to ignore them. They wanted to live. In a spacious, sun-drenched apartment in the Mokotów district, Jan Kowalski leaned over a huge drafting table. The scent of pencil shavings, paper, and hot coffee was his element. He was an architect, a man who believed in the logic of straight lines and the harmony of proportions. Right now, he was working on a project for a new school, bright, modern, with enormous windows and spacious classrooms. He was building the future. On the pristine sheet of paper, a world of order and reason was being born, a world with no room for chaos and destruction. From the next room came the sound of a piano. Elżbieta was playing, a Chopin nocturne. The melody seemed woven from the very Warsaw air, languid, tender, with a light, barely perceptible sadness. Elżbieta was the soul of this home. If Jan created the forms, she filled them with meaning, emotion, life. Her world was made not of concrete but of notes, colors, and poems. She was the guardian of their hearth, a warmth that could neither be drawn nor built. On the carpet, next to the piano, 6-year-old Adam was building a castle from wooden blocks, and circling this castle, making an inspection tour, hopped the white rabbit, Pushek. He was a birthday present for Adam, and the boy adored him. He shared his toys, his secrets, and even his sweets with him. Pushek was not just a pet. He was a full member of the family, a small, fluffy symbol of their calm, orderly life. In the evening, they sat on the balcony, drinking tea and watching the city sink into violet twilight. John talked about his school, about how bright the corridors would be. Elżbieta dreamed of a trip to the sea next year. Adam, nestled against his father, quietly listed the names of all his toy soldiers. "Did you hear what Beck said on the radio?" Elżbieta suddenly asked, her voice trembling slightly, shattering the evening idyll. Jan paused, taking a large sip of tea. "I heard. It's just diplomatic games. Nothing will happen, I assure you. This is the 20th century. Nobody starts a war over some corridor. People have become smarter." He said it with confidence, the same way he spoke of the strength of a foundation or the reliability of support structures. He believed in reason, in pacts, treaties, in the power of the human intellect. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the armor of his logic, a cold, sticky fear stirred. He saw it in the eyes of people on the streets, heard it in the tense silence of his neighbors, felt it in the unnatural quiet that sometimes hung over the city. It was a premonition of disaster, as irrational as the shadow of a cloud on a clear day. Late that night, when everyone else was asleep, Jan stood by the window for a long time. The city below shone with thousands of lights, living its life, unaware that its hours were numbered. He looked at this vast, complex organism and thought about how fragile it really was. One precise blow, and all this magnificence, this intricate system of streets, buildings, and destinies, would crumble to dust. He pushed the thought away. Tomorrow would be a new day, the first day of autumn. Adam needed to get ready for school. He had to submit his project. In their world, everything was going according to plan. That night, Adam slept with Pushek in his arms, never suspecting that the soft thumping he would hear in a few hours would not be the beating of his pet's heart, but the distant, distinct roar of bombers carrying the end of their world on their wings. The dawn of September 1st, 1939, was unusually quiet and gray. The sky was covered with low clouds, as if it wanted to hide the city from what was about to happen. The first sounds that woke the Kowalski family were unlike anything they had ever heard before. It was not the rumble of thunder or the clatter of a tram. It was a hollow, prolonged wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wail of an air raid siren. Jan leaped out of bed, his heart instantly hammering in a frantic rhythm. He rushed to the window. The street below was deserted, but the very air hung with tension. "What is that? A drill?" Elżbieta mumbled sleepily, sitting up in bed. But Jan already understood. His rational world, his blueprints and calculations lost all meaning in an instant. He realized that his most terrifying, most irrational fear was becoming a reality. "Quickly! To the hallway! Away from the windows!" he shouted, a steely note in his voice that Elżbieta had never heard before. He grabbed a sleepy, bewildered Adam, who instinctively clutched the awakened and terrified Pushek. At that moment, the distant, low hum they had mistaken for the wind began to grow rapidly, turning into a deafening roar. It felt as if the sky itself was cracking at the seams, and then came the first explosion. For a few seconds they stood in the hallway, stunned and disoriented. The entire building shuddered as if struck by a giant hammer. Plaster rained down from the walls and dishes rattled in the china cabinet. Adam screamed, burying his face in his father's pajamas. "This is it," Elżbieta whispered, her face as white as chalk. "They've started." Jan didn't answer. He was already acting. The survival instinct long dormant within the civilized man had awakened. The bathroom. "Now!" he commanded. He knew the bathroom had the strongest walls and no windows. He pushed his wife and son into the small room and went back for their documents and whatever cash he could find. At that moment, a second explosion hit. Much closer. A deafening, devastating blast. A wave of hot air threw Jan to the floor. The living room windows shattered inward with a piercing shriek, becoming a million glittering, lethal shards. The bookshelf, Elżbieta's pride, collapsed, burying volumes of Mickiewicz and Słowacki. The beloved piano let out a mournful, jarring chord and fell silent forever. Deaf in one ear, Jan struggled to his feet. An unbearable ringing filled his head. Their entire apartment, their cozy, lovingly arranged world, had been turned to rubble in a matter of seconds. The air filled with acrid dust and the smell of something burning. He crawled back to the bathroom. Elżbieta's face was a mask of terror. Adam was crying, a quiet, soundless weeping that shook his whole body. Pushek had hidden under the bathtub and wasn't moving. Suddenly there came a rising, soul-chilling whistle. This sound was different. It was personal, aimed directly at them. Jan only had time to shield his wife and son with his body, pressing them into the corner between the wall and the cast-iron tub. The last thing he remembered was a blinding, unbearable flash and a roar that seemed to tear the very universe apart. Time stopped, and then darkness and weight crashed down upon them. When Jan regained consciousness, he didn't immediately know where he was. It was absolutely dark and silent. Unnaturally silent. There was almost no air. He moved and realized he was pinned by something heavy. A part of the ceiling had collapsed on them. They had been saved by the sturdy cast-iron bathtub, which had created a small pocket of life in this chaos of death. "Elżbieta, Adam," he rasped, his voice sounding hollow and strange. "We're alive," came his wife's faint whisper. "I think." He understood that they were buried alive in the ruins of their own home. Their world hadn't just collapsed. It had entombed them in its debris. In that moment, Jan Kowalski, the former architect, realized that all his knowledge of material strength and the laws of physics now boiled down to one thing: get out or die. And he knew he had to become not just a husband and father, but the engineer of their salvation, no matter the cost. Imagine the sensation of being buried alive. A darkness that presses not only on your eyes, but on your very soul. A silence broken only by the thud of your own heart and the ragged breathing of your loved ones, and the dust. A fine, acrid construction dust that clogs your nose, your mouth, your lungs, turning every breath into an agony. In this darkness and silence, they spent hours that felt like an eternity. Panic, cold and clammy, rose in their throats, threatening to suffocate them. But Jan would not let it take hold of him or his family. He talked. In a calm, steady voice, as if explaining a blueprint, he told them what they were going to do. He made Elżbieta and Adam answer him to make sure they were conscious. He turned his voice into an instrument, a lifeline cast into the abyss of their despair. When the initial shock wore off, Jan began to act. By feel, inch by inch, he explored their stone prison. His fingers, accustomed to the smoothness of paper, now traced the sharp edges of broken brick, the cold roughness of concrete, and the slick surface of damaged pipes. He was an architect in a world he had designed, now destroyed. He found a small gap from which a faint draft flowed. This was their chance. For hours, bloodying his fingernails, he loosened and pulled out one brick after another, widening the opening. Every movement sent a dull ache through his body, but he didn't stop. When the passage was wide enough, he squeezed through to the outside. What he saw made him freeze. Where their street had been was a mangled heap of stone, twisted metal, and smoldering beams. The city had been transformed into an apocalyptic landscape painted by a mad artist. The sky, shrouded in black smoke, seemed to press down on the ruins. Jan helped Elżbieta and Adam climb out. They stood in the middle of what, just yesterday, had been their life and said nothing. There were no words. There was only shock, and a quiet, frightened squeak. From beneath the rubble, Pushek emerged, covered in dust, but alive. Adam rushed to him, clutching him to his chest, and this tiny ball of life, miraculously saved from hell, became the only anchor keeping them afloat in an ocean of madness. They started walking. They didn't know where. Just away from their ruined home. They walked through a ghost city. Around them were others just like them. People with empty eyes, covered in dust and soot, wandering to nowhere. Soldiers ran past them, ambulances drove by. Somewhere ahead, they could hear gunfire, and from the sky the hateful drone of planes returned. They ran, hid in alleyways, dropped to the ground at the sound of nearby explosions. Their path was chaotic, instinctive. They headed where they thought it might be safer, across the bridge to the other side of the Vistula to the Praga district. They thought that there, in the large park where the zoo was located, they would find shelter. It was an irrational hope, but it was the only thing they had left. When, exhausted and weak, they reached the gates of the zoo, another shock awaited them. The zoo, which they remembered as an oasis of green and cheerful noise, had also been bombed. Some of the enclosures were destroyed, trees were toppled. The air was filled with a strange, gruesome mix of smells, burning, blood, and wild animal fear. They saw a dead giraffe, its neck stretched out unnaturally, its wide-open eyes staring at the black sky. In the ruined monkey house, wounded animals moaned softly. It was a surreal hell where the world of humans and the world of beasts merged in a single agony. They wandered through the deserted alleys, past shattered cages, and despair began to consume them again. There was no salvation here either. And then Jan saw it. The bear enclosure. It was a massive structure of thick concrete and steel bars. A bomb had fallen nearby, destroying part of the fence. But the cage itself, the den carved into the artificial rock, was intact. It was empty. The bears had probably been killed or escaped. In that moment, something clicked in the mind of Jan Kowalski, the architect. He looked at this cage not as a prison for a beast, but as a perfect bomb shelter. Strong, secure, protected. In here, he said, his voice firm. Elżbieta looked at him in horror. In a cage? Jan, we can't. But he wasn't listening. He was already inspecting the structure, testing the strength of the bars, assessing the thickness of the walls. It was madness, but it was their only salvation. He helped his wife and son climb inside. He dragged the heavy, blast-twisted gate behind him and blocked the entrance with chunks of concrete. They were trapped, behind bars, in a stranger's stinking den. But for the first time in many hours, they felt relatively safe. At that moment, they didn't yet know that this cage would become their home, their fortress, and their curse for 20 long days. They didn't know they would have to share their territory with the corpses of exotic animals, that at night they would hear the howling of maddened predators, and that their most fearsome enemy would not be a bomb, but a quiet, all-consuming hunger. They just sat in the darkness, huddled together, listening as their world died outside. The first night in the bear cage was like a fever dream. Their minds refused to accept the reality of the situation. Just yesterday, they had slept in soft beds in their cozy apartment, and now they were lying on cold, damp concrete, breathing the persistent, sour smell of a wild animal. From outside came sounds that made their blood run cold. It wasn't just explosions and gunfire. Other, unfamiliar primal sounds were mixed in. A long howl, a hysterical shriek, a low growl. These were the sounds of animals that had broken free from their enclosures, driven mad by fear and pain, roaming the ruined zoo. Adam trembled, his face buried in his mother's lap. "Mama, who's screaming?" he whispered. And Elżbieta, to calm him, began to invent a story. "It's just the animals playing, sweetheart. They're having a big costume party." Her voice shook as she spoke. She turned this nightmare into a dark fairy tale, and it was the only weapon she had against the horror. When dawn broke, Jan ventured out of the cage to scout. The first thing he realized was thirst. Sharp, agonizing. His mouth was completely dry. He knew they wouldn't last a day without water. And then the architect inside him awoke once more. He began not just to look at the ruins, but to analyze them. He remembered that any zoo must have a complex system of water supply and sewage. He followed the line of destroyed enclosures, carefully studying the ground, looking for manholes, pipes, drainage ditches. It was a dangerous excursion. The city was still under fire. But Jan was possessed by the idea. He found what he was looking for near the hippopotamus enclosure. Part of the pool was destroyed, and a thin stream of water trickled from a damaged drain pipe. It was murky and smelled foul, but it was water. He found a rusty tin can, filled it with the precious liquid, and brought it back to the cage. It was their first victory. Small, but incredibly important. They drank the stinking fluid in tiny sips, and it tasted better than the most expensive wine. They had conquered thirst, but a new enemy lay ahead: hunger. It crept up on them slowly, at first a light feeling of emptiness in the stomach. Then it grew into a dull, gnawing ache. Jan knew they needed food. He began to explore the zoo grounds more systematically. He avoided open spaces, moving in short dashes, hiding behind ruins. He searched the destroyed administrative buildings, pavilions, and animal kitchens. Almost everything was destroyed or looted. But he got lucky. In the basement of one building, he found a sack of oats for the horses and a few heads of half-rotten cabbage. It was a treasure. Returning to the cage, he divided his prize. They chewed the hard, tasteless oat grains and crunched on the bitter cabbage leaves. It wasn't food, but fuel, necessary to keep the fire of life burning. Thus, their system began to form. John became the leader, the provider, the protector. He established a strict routine. During the day, they sat quietly in the cage. At night, when the bombing eased slightly, he went on his dangerous forays. He fortified their shelter, blocking the entrance with more stones, leaving only a narrow crawl space. In a ruined shed, he found old sacks and spread them on the concrete floor to make it less cold to sleep on. Elżbieta was in charge of their inner world. She turned their prison into a semblance of a home. She maintained what cleanliness she could. She rationed the food and water. And most importantly, she took care of Adam. She told him endless stories, using the animals they saw as characters. The dead giraffe in her stories was just tired and lying down to rest. The crazed wolves howling at night were singing their sad songs. She created an alternate reality for her son to shield his fragile psyche from the horrors of war. Adam, in turn, cared for Pushek. He shared his crumbs of cabbage with him and cleaned his fur. The little rabbit was not just a toy. He was a responsibility. He gave the boy's life meaning when everything around them had lost it. So they created their own microcosm, their empire built from chaos. They had their own laws, their own economy, their own culture. Their shelter, the bear's cage, became for them both the Noah's Ark and a prison. They were surviving. But every day brought new trials. They witnessed horrific scenes. One day they saw a pack of feral dogs attack a wounded antelope. Another time, an elephant, maddened by hunger and fear, passed their cage, trumpeting so loudly it felt like their eardrums would burst. The war was erasing the line between man and beast, not just figuratively, but literally. And they did not yet know that their most terrifying confrontation with predators was yet to come. But these predators would be on two legs. The days bled into one long gray blur, punctuated by the flashes of explosions and Jan's nightly expeditions. Their life fell into a harsh but predictable rhythm. The cage became their world. They grew accustomed to its smell, to the cold of its walls, to the bars that cast striped shadows on them, making them look like true prisoners. However, this stability was as fragile as thin ice, and soon it cracked. The first thing to break was not the concrete, but the human spirit. Elżbieta, who had held on so bravely for her son's sake, began to give way. The endless tension, the hunger, the fear, and the horror of it all were eroding her from within. One afternoon, while Adam was sleeping, she suddenly began to cry. quietly at first, then louder, more inconsolably. These weren't just tears. It was the cry of a soul pushed to its absolute limit. "I can't do this anymore, Jan," she whispered, her body racked with sobs. "We're living like animals. In a cage. We're eating garbage. We're drinking filth. What have we become? Look at Adam." He stopped smiling. "He looks like a little old man. Maybe it would have been better if we had died back in our home. It would have been quick. But this is a slow, agonizing death." John sat beside her in silence. He didn't know what to say. In his pragmatic world, there was no room for despair. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. But he could see his wife was on the brink. This was a rebellion. Not against him, but against fate. A rebellion against the war that had taken everything from them, even their humanity. "You're wrong," he finally said, his voice as hard as steel. "We are alive, and that's what matters. We are breathing. We are together. And as long as we are together, we are a family, not animals. Do you understand? We have to survive." For him, he nodded toward the sleeping Adam. His words were as brutal as a slap. He wasn't comforting her. He was giving an order. He was applying that same surgical cruelty, cutting away her despair like an infected tissue. He couldn't let her break, because he knew if she broke, the guardian of their souls, they would all be doomed. Elżbieta looked at him, her eyes full of tears and resentment. But in the depths of her despairing soul, his words found a resonance. She looked at the small sleeping bundle, at her son, and realized Jan was right. She did not have the right to give up. This difficult, painful conversation strengthened their bond. They understood that their only weapon was to be together, to be a single entity. But while they fought their internal enemy, an external enemy was creeping toward them. The resources in the zoo were running out. Jan found less and less to eat. The hunger was becoming sharper, and it attracted the attention of the ruined city's other inhabitants. Not animals. People. One night Jan went out on his usual foray. He was already returning to the cage, carrying a precious prize, a few half-raw potatoes he had dug up from what used to be a zookeeper's vegetable garden. Suddenly he heard voices. He froze, hiding behind the remains of a brick wall. 3 men approached the neighboring enclosure where lions used to live. They were looters, ragged with predatory, hungry eyes. They were rummaging through the corners, hoping to find anything of value. Jan's blood ran cold. He knew that if they were discovered, the men would show no mercy. They would take not only their last bit of food, but possibly their lives as well. "Nothing here, let's go," one of them grumbled. But another, the tallest one, suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. "Wait, you smell that? Smells like smoke." Jan cursed himself. A few days ago, he had built a primitive hearth in the far corner of their cage to get a little warmth and cook the oats. The smoke escaped through a crack in the ceiling, but apparently, the smell lingered. The looters moved slowly in their direction. Jan's heart pounded like a trapped bird. He knew it was too late to run. They would hear him. He clutched the sharpened piece of rebar he always carried. It was his only weapon. He was not a soldier. He was an architect. But he knew that now he would have to defend his family, his home, his cage. And he was prepared to kill. The looters reached the bars of their shelter. "Well, look who's made themselves at home here," the tall one smirked, peering inside. Elżbieta, awakened by the noise, cried out and shielded Adam with her body. In that instant, Jan made his move. He didn't wait for them to try to enter. He burst from his hiding place like a wild beast protecting its lair. With a low, furious roar, he lunged at the nearest looter, striking with his improvised spear. The blow was short and precise. The rebar sank into the looter's shoulder. He howled in pain and surprise, stumbling backward. His companions were stunned for a moment. They hadn't expected such a ferocious counterattack from a man they considered easy prey. That hesitation gave Jan precious seconds. He was no warrior. His body was not used to fighting, but the primal rage of a father protecting his young spoke within him. A fire of such desperation burned in his eyes that even these dregs of society felt fear. He didn't scream. He roared, like the bear, the master of this cage whom they had disturbed. The tall looter, recovering his senses, pulled out a knife. "You rat, I'll gut you," he hissed, stepping forward. But Jan did not retreat. He stood his ground, his bloodied rebar held forward, ready for a second strike. He wasn't just defending his life. He was defending his world, his small, fragile empire built in the midst of chaos. He was defending his son's right to wake up tomorrow morning. At that moment, a piercing scream came from the depths of the cage. It was Elżbieta. But it was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of fury. She had grabbed one of the stones Jan had used to fortify the entrance and, with incredible strength, hurled it at the attackers. The stone hit the third looter in the head. He grunted and fell to the ground. The sight of their wounded companion, the fury of the husband, and the unexpected attack from the wife finally broke their will to fight. They realized these people in the cage were not victims. They were predators, just like them, and they were ready to fight to the death. "To hell with them, let's get out of here," the tall one snapped. They grabbed their wounded comrade and quickly vanished into the night, leaving Jan alone, breathing heavily, the rebar trembling in his hands. He had won. He had defended his home. But the price of this victory was high. The adrenaline subsided, and a wave of nausea and weakness washed over him. He looked at his hands, at the blood on them, someone else's blood. He, Jan Kowalski, the architect, the man who built homes, had just nearly killed another human being. The war had forced him to cross a line he thought he would never cross. He returned to the cage. Elżbieta rushed to him, embracing him. She was crying, but these were tears not of fear, but of pride and relief. Adam, awakened by the screams, looked at his father with wide, frightened eyes. He didn't understand what had happened, but he sensed it was something terrible. Jan sat on the floor, pulling his wife and son close. He had won this battle, but he felt he had lost something important inside himself. He had changed. He had become harder, more beast-like. He had finally truly become an inhabitant of this cage. That night was their climax, the point of no return. They understood that the most terrifying monsters were not the bombers in the sky or the wild beasts in the ruins. The most terrifying monsters are people, driven to desperation. And to survive in this world, they would have to become just like them. Their small war for survival continued, but now they had a new, most merciless enemy, hunger, which grew more unbearable with each passing day. And this enemy forced them to look upon the last bastion of their pre-war life, the little white rabbit, no longer as a member of the family, but as food. After the clash with the looters, their life changed. The sense of false security was gone. Now Jan never strayed far from the cage, and they barricaded the entrance with stones even during the day. They lived in constant fear, listening to every rustle. But there was an enemy more terrifying than any looter. Hunger. It was no longer just an unpleasant sensation. It had become a constant, debilitating pain. It drained their strength, made them irritable and apathetic. Their conversations grew shorter. Their world had shrunk to a single thought. Food. Adam suffered the most. He stopped playing and barely spoke. He would just lie curled up in a ball, staring blankly at nothing. His face grew thin, and his large eyes seemed to hold an unchildlike anguish. Jan watched his fading son, and his heart clenched with helpless fury. He was ready to do anything to save him. And that's when his gaze began to fall more and more often on Pushek. The rabbit, unlike them, was not starving. Adam gave it almost all of his meager share of food, cabbage leaves, oat grains, and Pushek remained white, fluffy, and relatively well-fed. Jan pushed the thought away. It was monstrous. Impossible. Pushek was Adam's friend. To kill it would mean killing the last spark of childhood, the last spark of light in his son's soul. But the hunger was relentless. It whispered, tempted, argued. It's not betrayal, it said. It's a necessity. It is not murder, but a sacrifice. A sacrifice to save a child. One night, while Adam and Elżbieta slept, Jan sat for a long time, watching the rabbit. On the scales of his conscience, he weighed two incompatible things: Pushek's life and Adam's life, and he realized the choice had already been made, not by him, but by the war itself. He reached for the piece of rebar he had used to defend them from the looters. But at that moment, Elżbieta woke up. She understood everything without a word. "No, Jan, don't," she whispered. "I'm begging you." "He's dying," Jan answered hollowly. "You can see it yourself. He needs protein, meat. If he doesn't eat, he won't make it to the end of the week." "He's his friend," she said in desperation. "The dead don't need friends," Jan cut her off brutally. He had become a different man. The architect who believed in harmony had turned into a primitive hunter, ready to do anything for the survival of his offspring. He picked up the rabbit. It struggled in his hands. Jan turned away so he wouldn't see its frightened, beady eyes. He prepared to strike. And in that instant, Adam's quiet voice spoke. "Papa, what are you doing with Pushek?" Jan froze. He turned around slowly. Adam was standing in the middle of the cage, looking at him. There was no fear in his eyes, only confusion and boundless trust. And that trust hit Jan harder than any bomb. He looked at his son, then at the trembling rabbit in his hands, then at the sharpened rebar, and he knew he couldn't. He couldn't do it. If he killed Pushek in front of his son, he might save his body, but he would kill his soul. He would forever destroy the world Elżbieta had worked so hard to preserve for him. He slowly lowered the rabbit to the floor. Pushek immediately scurried over to Adam. The boy hugged him, pressing him close. "I won't eat him, Papa," he said quietly, as if he had read his father's thoughts. "It's better if we all starve together." Jan sat down on the floor and covered his face with his hands. In that moment, he broke. His iron will, his pragmatism, his surgical cruelty, it all crumbled to dust before the quiet words of a 6-year-old child. He had lost this battle, and this defeat was his greatest victory. He had preserved the man within himself. They had preserved the family within themselves. They sat together in the cold, dark cage, a man, a woman, a child, and a rabbit. Hungry, exhausted, but not broken. They didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but they knew they would face that tomorrow together. And it was at this moment, in this hour of their deepest despair, that fate had one last, most unexpected twist in store for them. In the ensuing silence, they heard a new sound. It was not the wail of a siren or the roar of an explosion. It was the screech of brakes and clear German speech. The war for Warsaw was coming to its tragic end. September 28th, 1939. The defense of Warsaw had ceased. The city had capitulated. The roar of cannons and the wail of bombers were replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the clank of tank treads and sharp commands in German. For the Kowalski family, this silence was more terrifying than any cannonade. What did it mean? Salvation or death at the hands of the city's new masters? They sat in their cage, holding their breath. They could hear soldiers walking through the zoo grounds. They heard their laughter, their conversations. One day, one of them came very close to their shelter. Their hearts stopped. The soldier shone a flashlight through a gap in their barricade, muttered something like, "Empty cage," and walked away. 2 more days passed. The hunger became unbearable. Their water supply ran out. Jan realized they had no choice. To stay in the cage any longer meant a slow death. They had to get out. But out to where? Into a city occupied by the enemy? It was a leap into the unknown. For the last time, they sat together in their strange home. Jan looked at Elżbieta, at Adam, who was holding Pushik in his arms. 20 days. They had lived for 20 days in a bear cage, in a hell of fire and steel. They had survived. "It's time," Jan said quietly. He dismantled the stone barricade. Bright sunlight hit their eyes, making them squint. They emerged from their den, slowly, uncertainly, like newborns. The air outside was fresh, almost sweet after the stale stench of the cage. The zoo was quiet and deserted. Nature was already beginning to reclaim it. Grass pushed through the broken tiles, birds perched on the ruins. They walked along the familiar alleys toward the exit, and then a German patrol spotted them. 2 young soldiers with rifles. At the sight of the strange, ragged family emerging from the ruins, they grew wary, raising their weapons. "Halt! Where da? Stop! Who goes there?" came a sharp cry. Jan raised his hands, showing they were unarmed. He tried to explain in the broken German he had learned in school who they were. That they were civilians, that their home was destroyed, that they had been hiding here. The soldiers looked at them with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. What did they look like? Ragged, filthy savages. They smelled of smoke, decay, and fear. An officer, drawn by the commotion, looked them over with disdain. "Where were you hiding?" he asked. Jan, suspecting nothing, pointed to the bear enclosure. "There, in the cage." The officer looked at the cage, then back at Jan. A flicker of astonishment crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by a contemptuous smirk. He said something to his soldiers, and they roared with laughter. He didn't believe him. He decided he was looking at a madman, and that was what saved them. If he had believed them, they could have been suspected of anything. Espionage, sabotage. But as it was, they were just pathetic refugees, driven insane by the war. They weren't even interrogated. "Get out of here!" the officer snapped, waving a hand toward the city. They walked away. They left the zoo gates and merged into the stream of other refugees trudging through the ruined streets of Warsaw. No one paid them any attention. They were just another family who had lost their home, just more victims of the war. Their incredible story of life in a cage, their odyssey of survival, their small victory over chaos, turned out to be unwanted and uninteresting. It sounded like the ravings of a lunatic, and they realized they could never speak of it. The experience was too terrifying, too irrational for a normal person to comprehend. Their salvation had turned into a new prison, a prison of silence. Their feat, their 20-day battle for life, was buried under the cynical laughter of a German officer. It became their family secret, a scar they would carry in their souls for the rest of their days. They had survived, but they were never destined to return from their own private hell. The war ended. Warsaw, destroyed almost to its foundations, slowly, painfully rose from the ashes. People learned to live again. The Kowalski family survived too. They survived the occupation, the uprising, the liberation. Fate, having thrown them into the very epicenter of hell, had somehow allowed them to live. But they were never the same again. Jan Kowalski, the architect who had dreamed of building bright schools, never returned to his profession. He could no longer draw straight lines. After seeing the chaos into which the most orderly world could descend, he had lost his faith in harmony. He worked as a simple foreman on construction sites, rebuilding other people's homes, but he was never able to rebuild his own inner world. He often had nightmares. Again and again, he found himself in the dark, damp cage, and through the bars, eyes stared back at him. The eyes of a looter or a hungry beast. He would wake up in a cold sweat and for a long time be unable to figure out where he was. Elżbieta changed too. She rarely played the piano anymore. Music, which had once been her salvation, now reminded her of all they had lost. She became quiet, withdrawn. In her eyes, the shadow of that dreadful autumn settled forever. She devoted her life to her son, trying to heal the wounds the war had left on his soul with her love and care. Adam grew up to be a quiet, thoughtful young man. He did well in school and read a lot, but he lacked the vibrant energy of his peers. He avoided noisy gatherings, preferring solitude. He never asked his parents for a pet. That experience, lived at the age of 6, left a deep, indelible mark on him. He had vague memories of those 20 days. In his mind, they were a terrifying, dark fairy tale his mother used to tell him. But he remembered the feeling of constant fear, the taste of raw oats, and the image of his father standing with a piece of iron in his hands protecting them. And he remembered the soft fur of Pushek. The rabbit had survived it all with them and died of old age after the war. They buried him under an apple tree in their small garden, and for a long time, Adam would bring fresh carrots to his grave. They never told anyone their story. Once, in the 50s, Jan tried to share his memories with a colleague. The man listened, patted him on the shoulder and said, "Yes, brother. The war drove many people mad. The things you imagine." After that, Jan fell silent forever. Their feat proved to be too inconvenient, too unbelievable a truth for a world that wanted to forget its nightmares. Their story remained their secret, their personal legend. Jan Kowalski died of a heart attack in the early 70s. Elżbieta outlived him by 10 years and passed away peacefully in her sleep. Adam lived a long life and became a respected university professor, a specialist in classical literature. He never married or had children. Their line ended with him. It seemed that the story of the Kowalski family, their 20-day odyssey in a cage, would disappear with them. But sometimes, sorting through his father's old papers, Adam would find a yellowed sheet of paper. It was the miraculously preserved blueprint of the very school Jan had been designing before the war. And on the back of this blueprint, in pencil, in an unsteady hand, a few phrases were written. September 1939. Zoo. Bear cage. 20 days. We survived. This was all that remained of their story. A short, dry report. But behind these words lay an entire life, full of terror, despair, courage, and love. Thus ends the chronicle of the Kowalski family. Official history did not preserve their names. In the archival records of the Warsaw bombings, they are counted only in the column labeled civilian casualties. The history of the Warsaw Zoo has its own heroic chapter, but it is linked to the name of its director, Jan Żabinski, and his wife, Antonina, who hid Jews on the zoo's grounds during the occupation, saving them from death. This is a great feat, about which books have been written and films have been made. But the story of the Kowalski family, who were saving not others but themselves, who were not heroes of the resistance, but simply people driven into a cage, remained unknown. It did not fit into the heroic chronicle of the war. It was too horrifying, too naturalistic, too inconvenient in its truth about what war turns a person into. But such stories never disappear completely. They pass into folklore, become urban legends whispered from one person to another. And after the war, as workers cleared the rubble of the destroyed zoo, a strange tale circulated among them. It was said that one of them found a small handmade toy in the old bear cage, a little figure carved from a piece of wood, and nearby, a child's drawing was scratched on the wall, 3 people and a white rabbit. They said that at night, a soft weeping could sometimes be heard in that cage. Of course, these were just rumors, born of post-war devastation and human grief. But perhaps it was memory itself, the very soul of the place, trying to tell its forgotten story. The story of how an architect who lost his world managed to build a new one in a bear's den. Of how a woman, with the power of her love and her fairy tales, conquered madness. And of how a little boy, through his compassion for a rabbit, saved his parents' souls from their final fall into the abyss. This story is not a chronicle of battles or a report of heroic deeds. It is a reminder that the most terrible battles of the Second World War were waged not on the fields of war, but in the souls of ordinary people. That sometimes to survive you must become a beast, But to remain human, one must find the strength to conquer that beast. And that even in the darkest, deepest cage where fate can trap us, there's always a choice: to yield to the darkness or to preserve the light within. The Kowalski family made their choice, and their quiet, unknown feat was perhaps no less great than those recorded in the history books.